You don't belong here, and we both know it." Those words would soon come back to haunt Helena Richardson in ways she could never imagine. But at 5:30 a.m. in a Chicago penthouse 40 floors above the awakening city, 19-year-old Cameron Mitchell was thinking about something entirely different as he stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows watching the first planes of the day taxi across the distant runways of O'Hare International Airport. The morning light painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, and Cameron could see the controlled chaos of aviation beginning to unfold below a dance of metal and purpose that his family had helped orchestrate for 3 generations. His father's voice carried from the kitchen a warm baritone that had commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals, now simply asking if Cameron wanted extra syrup on his pancakes. "Just a little thanks, Dad," Cameron called back, pulling his favorite slate-gray hoodie over his head, the Supreme logo barely visible against the soft cotton that had cost more than most people spent on their entire wardrobe, though he wore it like any college student might wear a hand-me-down from an older brother. Victor Mitchell appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 plates of perfectly golden pancakes. His own attire a sharp contrast to his son's casual choice, dressed in a crisp navy suit that spoke of important meetings and decisions that would ripple through the aviation industry. At 54, Victor carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had built an empire from nothing, transforming a small aircraft maintenance shop inherited from his father into Mitchell Global Aviation, a conglomerate that owned airports, airlines, and the infrastructure that kept the world moving through the skies. "You know," Victor said, settling into the chair across from Cameron at the breakfast table, "when I was your age, I thought wearing a suit made me important, made people take me seriously." He watched his son drizzle syrup with the careful precision that Cameron applied to everything from coding algorithms to negotiating with venture capitalists who were twice his age. Cameron looked up his dark eyes, holding an intelligence that had impressed Harvard professors and intimidated Silicon Valley executives, though right now they simply held the warmth of a son enjoying breakfast with his father. "And now you know better?" he asked, cutting into his pancakes with the same methodical approach that had made him the youngest person ever to earn a dual degree in aerospace engineering and computer science. "Now I know that respect isn't something you wear," Victor replied, his voice carrying the weight of lessons learned through years of fighting for recognition in boardrooms where he was often the only blackface building success, despite countless people who looked at him and saw only what they expected to see instead of the brilliant mind that would eventually reshape how the world thought about air travel. The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with the understanding that came from shared experiences of being judged, underestimated, and forced to prove themselves worthy of spaces that others took for granted. Cameron had grown up in this world of privilege, but he'd also grown up aware that his presence in certain rooms was often questioned, his achievements attributed to his father's wealth rather than his own remarkable intellect. "The London meeting is important," son Victor said, reaching across to touch Cameron's hand with the gentle affection of a father who had lost his wife when Cameron was just 12, making their bond even stronger as they navigated the world together. "The technology you've developed for reducing aircraft emissions could change everything, make air travel sustainable for the next century." Cameron nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that came with being Victor Mitchell's son, carrying forward a legacy that was about more than money or power, but about opening doors for others who might not otherwise have the chance to walk through them. "I know, Dad. I just wish sometimes I could travel like a normal person, you know. Without all the attention, without people either treating me like I'm special because of who you are or treating me like I don't belong because of how I look." Victor's expression softened, remembering his own son's first experience with racial profiling at age 7, when a security guard had followed them through an upscale department store, assuming the well-dressed black man and his child must be up to something suspicious. "The world tests us, Cameron, in ways it doesn't test others. But that's also what makes us stronger, what makes us more aware of the need to fight for justice and dignity for everyone." As they finished breakfast, Cameron gathered his things for the trip packing light as always, preferring comfort over the formal attire that his status might suggest. His laptop bag contained presentations that would soon be reviewed by the European Aviation Authority, proposals that could revolutionize how the industry approached environmental responsibility, though he looked like any college student heading home for the weekend. "Take care of yourself in London," Victor said, embracing his son with the fierce protectiveness of a father who had spent 19 years trying to shield his child from the worst of humanity's prejudices, while also preparing him to face them with dignity and strength. "And remember, son, you don't have to prove yourself to anyone. You belong wherever you choose to be." Cameron smiled, shouldering his backpack and heading toward the elevator, unaware that in just a few hours those words would be tested in ways that would challenge everything he believed about justice, power, and the price of standing up for what was right. Helena Richardson stood in the marble-appointed lobby of the Palmer House Hotel, her Hermes bag clutched like a shield against her chest, as she surveyed the morning chaos with the critical eye of someone who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of maintaining social position through sheer force of will and strategic indignation. At 52, Helena possessed the kind of carefully constructed elegance that came from decades of country club luncheons, charity galas, and the exhausting work of remaining relevant in Chicago's elite social circles. Her blonde hair styled into a helmet of precision that could withstand hurricane winds, her Chanel suit tailored to disguise the softening that came with middle age and too many three-martini afternoons. "Patricia, honestly, the service standards everywhere are simply declining," Helena declared to her traveling companion, Patricia Wells, a woman whose primary qualification for friendship was her willingness to serve as an audience for Helena's endless commentary on the state of modern society. When Charles was alive, the staff at establishments like this knew how to treat people of quality. Patricia nodded dutifully, though privately she often wondered if Helena's increasing demands for deference had more to do with her growing insecurity than any actual decline in service quality. Since Charles Richardson's death from a heart attack 18 months earlier, Helena had become more aggressive in her assertions of status, as if she could somehow command respect through volume and entitlement, rather than earning it through kindness or genuine accomplishment. The truth, which Helena would never admit even to herself, was that her privileged position had always been precarious, built on the foundation of her late husband's pharmaceutical fortune, rather than any achievements of her own. Her childhood had been marked by her father's bankruptcy when she was 14, a catastrophic loss that had stripped away everything she thought was permanent, teaching her that social position could disappear overnight unless you fought constantly to maintain it. She had clawed her way back through a strategic marriage to Charles, a man 20 years her senior, who had needed a beautiful wife to complement his pharmaceutical empire, and she had spent 3 decades perfecting the role of the perfect society wife, hosting charity events and serving on museum boards, always aware that her position depended entirely on maintaining the right connections and never showing weakness to those who might see her fall as an opportunity for their own advancement. The car should be here any moment. Helena continued checking her Cartier watch with the impatience of someone who believed punctuality was a courtesy owed to her rather than a mutual responsibility. "I specifically requested our regular driver, the one who understands the importance of arriving at the airport with sufficient time for proper check-in procedures." Patricia, who had been Helena's closest friend since their boarding school days, sometimes felt like she was watching a performance rather than having a conversation, as Helena's voice took on the imperious tone that had become more pronounced since Charles's death, as if she were trying to fill the space his authority had once occupied. The black Mercedes pulled up to the hotel's entrance, and Helena immediately began her inspection routine, checking that the interior was clean, that the driver was properly attired, that every detail met her exacting standards for how people of their caliber should be transported. She had learned long ago that the world would treat you exactly as well as you demanded to be treated, and she had spent decades demanding excellence from everyone around her. As they settled into the leather seats, Helena's mind was already racing ahead to their first-class flight to London, where she planned to attend a gallery opening and meet with the directors of a prominent charity organization that had been courting her for a substantial donation. These trips were essential to maintaining her relevance, proving that even widowhood hadn't diminished her importance in the social hierarchy that had become her entire identity. "I do hope we don't encounter any of the usual airport nonsense," Helena mused, watching the Chicago skyline pass by through tinted windows. "It seems like every time I travel, there's some sort of disruption, people who don't understand proper airport etiquette, passengers trying to take advantage of the situation to upgrade themselves inappropriately." Patricia had heard these complaints countless times, understanding that Helena's anxiety about maintaining standards was really about her deep fear of losing control, of being seen as anything less than the queen of her carefully constructed world. The widow's increasing vigilance about social boundaries had become exhausting, but Patricia remained loyal, remembering the vulnerable young woman Helena had been before she learned to armor herself with privilege and demands. As their car approached O'Hare International Airport, Helena felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that came with air travel. The knowledge that airports were spaces where different worlds collided, where her carefully maintained social order could be challenged by the democratic chaos of modern aviation, where she would need to work even harder to ensure that everyone understood exactly where she belonged in the hierarchy of importance. She checked her reflection in her compact mirror one final time, ensuring that her appearance conveyed the proper message of authority and refinement, preparing for the battle of maintaining her position in a world that seemed increasingly determined to treat everyone the same, regardless of their obvious differences in breeding education and social standing. The premium departure lounge at Chicago O'Hare hummed with the subdued energy of first-class travel, a carefully orchestrated environment designed to make wealthy passengers feel appropriately separated from the masses below, with its leather seating areas arranged around low tables, displaying the morning's financial newspapers and crystal decanters filled with premium spirits even at 7 in the morning. Cameron Mitchell found a quiet corner near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac, pulling out his laptop to review the presentation he would deliver to the European Aviation Consortium in just 18 hours. His fingers moving across the keyboard with the fluid confidence of someone who had been coding since middle school and thinking about aircraft efficiency since he could walk. His hoodie drew a few curious glances from the other passengers, business travelers in expensive suits, who seemed surprised to see someone so young in the exclusive lounge. But Cameron had learned long ago to ignore the silent questions in their eyes, focusing instead on the work that gave his life meaning, beyond his family's wealth and influence. Across the lounge, Helena Richardson made her entrance with the theatrical flair of someone accustomed to being noticed, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she surveyed the available seating with the critical eye of a general choosing a battlefield, finally selecting a grouping of chairs that provided her with optimal visibility of the entire space and positioning herself where she could observe and, when necessary, correct any violations of proper lounge etiquette. "Patricia, look at this," Helena whispered, though her voice carried far enough to be heard by several nearby passengers, her manicured finger pointing discreetly toward Cameron. That young man by the window, dressed like he just rolled out of bed, probably some employee's child who managed to sneak in here while no one was paying attention. Patricia followed Helena's gaze, seeing only a teenager working quietly on his laptop, causing no disruption and bothering no one. But she had learned over the years that contradicting Helena's assessments was futile, and often led to hours of lectures about the importance of maintaining standards and protecting the privileges they had earned through proper breeding and social connections. Near the boarding gate, flight attendant Derek Walsh reviewed the passenger manifest for Flight 847 to London Heathrow, his 10 years of experience in premium service having taught him to anticipate the needs and demands of high-maintenance travelers, though his smile had grown increasingly mechanical as he dealt with passengers who treated him more like a servant than a safety professional. Derek prided himself on recognizing frequent flyers and VIP passengers, maintaining detailed mental notes about preferences and personalities that helped him provide the level of personalized service that justified the astronomical cost of first-class tickets. though lately he found himself growing tired of the constant need to defer to people who seemed to believe their wealth made them inherently more valuable than other human beings. Maria Santos. The gate agent responsible for coordinating the boarding process double-checked the special requests and upgrade lists, ensuring that every detail was perfect for a flight that would carry some of Chicago's most influential business leaders across the Atlantic, her professional demeanor masking the exhaustion that came from managing entitled passengers who viewed any minor inconvenience as a personal assault on their dignity. In another corner of the lounge, James Crawford, a venture capitalist in his early 40s, worked on his tablet while keeping one ear tuned to the conversations around him, his natural curiosity about human behavior making him an inadvertent observer of the social dynamics that played out in spaces where wealth and privilege created their own unspoken rules and hierarchies. James had built his fortune by understanding people, recognizing patterns, and predicting behavior in ways that allowed him to invest successfully in companies and founders that others overlooked. And he found airports particularly fascinating for the way they forced different social classes into close proximity, creating tensions that revealed character in ways that boardrooms and country clubs never could. As the boarding time approached, Cameron closed his laptop and gathered his minimal belongings. His backpack, containing everything he needed for a 3-day trip that would determine the future of sustainable aviation technology, though his casual appearance suggested nothing more important than a college student heading home for the weekend. Helena, meanwhile, had spent the past hour cataloging every perceived violation of lounge standards, from a businessman who spoke too loudly on his phone to a family whose children dared to express excitement about their upcoming trip, her running commentary to Patricia serving as a way to establish her authority as the unofficial guardian of proper behavior in premium travel spaces. The announcement for first-class boarding cut through the lounge's genteel atmosphere, prompting the familiar ritual of status-conscious passengers gathering their belongings and forming the kind of polite but determined line that only existed in spaces where everyone was accustomed to being treated as more important than everyone else around them. Cameron joined the queue without fanfare, his boarding pass indicating seat 2. The window seat he had specifically requested for its view during takeoff. Unaware that his choice of comfort over formality was about to trigger a confrontation that would expose the ugly underbelly of privilege and prejudice in ways that would reverberate far beyond a single flight to London. The Boeing 787's first-class cabin possessed the hushed elegance of an exclusive club with its cream leather seats that converted into fully flat beds, individual entertainment systems, and the kind of ambient lighting designed to make passengers forget they were hurtling through the atmosphere at 35,000 feet. Each pod offering privacy and luxury that cost more than most people earned in a month. Cameron settled into seat 2, stowing his backpack in the overhead compartment and immediately pulling out his noise-canceling headphones, a ritual that had helped him survive countless flights where his presence in premium cabins drew unwanted attention and whispered speculation about how someone his age could afford such expensive accommodations. The gentle hum of passengers finding their seats and settling in for the 8-hour journey to London created a familiar soundtrack, punctuated by the soft-spoken efficiency of flight attendants checking credentials and offering pre-departure beverages, their movements choreographed by years of experience, serving passengers who expected perfection as their birthright. Helena Richardson's entrance into the first-class cabin was preceded by the sharp staccato rhythm of her heels against the aircraft floor, a sound that seemed to announce her arrival and demand attention from everyone within earshot. Her eyes immediately scanning the cabin to ensure that everything met her exacting standards for proper premium travel arrangements. Her gaze locked onto Cameron seated comfortably by the window, with his headphones on, completely absorbed in whatever he was listening to, his casual attire and relaxed posture, creating an immediate dissonance with her expectations for the kind of passengers who belonged in first-class accommodations on international flights to major European capitals. "Excuse me, Helena," said her voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to immediate compliance, standing directly beside Cameron's seat with her carry-on bag positioned like a barrier between them. "I believe you're in my seat?" Cameron looked up slowly, removing one earbud and taking a moment to process the interruption, his expression remaining calm and polite despite the obvious challenge in the woman's voice and posture. "I'm sorry, but this is seat 2. "A," he replied, his voice steady and respectful, holding up his boarding pass to display the seat assignment clearly printed on the electronic ticket. Helena's eyes narrowed as she examined the boarding pass with the suspicious intensity of someone who had spent decades questioning things that didn't fit her world view. Her mind immediately jumping to the conclusion that some mistake had been made, that proper procedures had been violated, that the natural order of things required correction. "That can't be right," she declared, though she hadn't actually checked her own ticket, her certainty based entirely on her assumption that young black men in hoodies didn't belong in first-class seats, regardless of what any documentation might claim. First class is for premium passengers, people who've earned the right to be here through proper channels. Patricia Wells, settling into the seat across the aisle, watched the confrontation with growing discomfort, recognizing the familiar signs of Helena's escalating agitation when she encountered situations that challenged her sense of social order, though she had learned from experience that attempting to calm her friend often made these situations worse rather than better. Cameron felt the familiar weight of prejudice settling over the interaction, the way conversation shifted when people looked at him and saw only assumptions about what he could afford, what he deserved, where he belonged in the world. Though his father's teachings had prepared him for these moments and given him the tools to respond with dignity rather than anger. "Ma'am, I purchased this ticket 2 weeks ago," Cameron explained patiently, his voice remaining level despite the obvious unfairness of having to justify his presence to another passenger. "If you'd like to check your own seat assignment, I'm sure we can resolve any confusion quickly." But Helena had already decided that confusion was not the issue, that what she was witnessing was a deliberate attempt to circumvent proper procedures, possibly even fraud, and her voice rose with the indignation of someone who believed she was protecting not just her own interests, but the integrity of the entire first-class experience. "I don't need to check anything," she snapped, her voice carrying throughout the cabin and drawing the attention of other passengers who began to turn in their seats to observe the unfolding drama. "I've been flying first class for 20 years, and I know when someone doesn't belong here." Derek Walsh, the flight attendant, approached with the practiced diplomatic smile of someone who had mediated countless passenger disputes, though his internal reaction was already shaped by unconscious biases that made Helena's complaint seem more credible than Cameron's calm insistence that he belonged exactly where he was sitting. "Is there a problem here?" Derek asked, his question directed primarily toward Helena, his body language suggesting that he had already determined who was the legitimate passenger and who represented the disruption that needed to be managed and resolved quickly so the flight could depart on schedule. Helena turned toward Derek with the relief of someone who had found an ally in her fight against improper behavior, her voice taking on the authoritative tone of a customer who expected service professionals to support her position without question. "Yes, this young man is in my seat, and he's refusing to move to his proper location in the economy section." Cameron looked up at Derek, hoping to see fairness and professionalism, but instead, recognizing the same pattern he had encountered countless times before, the way authority figures often chose the path of least resistance rather than the path of justice, especially when the person demanding justice didn't look like their expectation of who deserved it. Derek Walsh found himself in the position that flight attendants dreaded most, standing between two passengers with conflicting claims, though his 15 years of experience had taught him to rely on certain assumptions about who was likely telling the truth, assumptions that were now leading him down a path that would soon destroy his career and reputation. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Derek asked Cameron, his tone already carrying the subtle implication that verification was necessary, that Cameron's claim to the seat required proof in ways that Helena's did not, his unconscious bias creating a double standard that would soon expose him to consequences he couldn't yet imagine. Cameron handed over his phone, the digital boarding pass, clearly displaying his name seat assignment and frequent flyer status, though Derek barely glanced at the screen before shaking his head with the dismissive confidence of someone who had already decided what the truth must be. "This looks like a screenshot," Derek announced loud enough for nearby passengers to hear his voice carrying the authority of someone making an official determination despite having no evidence to support his claim. "We've been having problems with people using fake boarding passes to upgrade themselves illegally." The accusation hit Cameron like a physical blow, the casual destruction of his credibility happening so quickly that he felt momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity of being called a fraud while sitting in a seat he had legitimately purchased his father's warnings about how the world would test him, suddenly feeling more prophetic than protective. "That's not a screenshot," Cameron replied firmly, his voice remaining steady despite the growing audience of passengers who were now openly watching the confrontation unfold. "That's the official airline app, and you can verify it by scanning the code with your device." But Derek had already moved beyond verification to enforcement, his mind made up by a combination of Helena's aggressive certainty and his own assumptions about who belonged in first class, his hand moving toward the scanner on his belt, not to check Cameron's credentials, but to call for backup to remove what he had decided was an unauthorized passenger. Helena watched the interaction with growing satisfaction, feeling vindicated in her assessment of the situation and pleased that proper authority was finally being exercised to restore order to the cabin, her sense of righteousness growing stronger with each moment that Derek supported her position over Cameron's protests. "I knew it," she declared triumphantly loud enough for the entire first-class section to hear. "These people think they can just walk onto a plane and take whatever they want, but there are still standards. Thank goodness there are still people willing to enforce them." James Crawford, the venture capitalist in seat 4. B felt his investigative instincts awakening as he watched the scene unfold, something about the young man's calm demeanor and articulate responses, suggesting that there was more to this story than appeared on the surface. His finger moving toward the record button on his phone as he sensed that he might be witnessing something significant. Patricia Wells shifted uncomfortably in her seat, recognizing the familiar escalation of Helena's confrontations with people she deemed inappropriate, though she had never seen her friend's prejudices expressed quite so publicly or aggressively, making her wonder if Charles's death had removed some restraining influence on Helena's behavior. "Sir, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and come with me," Derek announced, his voice taking on the official tone of someone exercising authority, completely ignoring Cameron's request to actually verify his boarding pass through proper channels. "We can sort this out at the gate, but right now you need to vacate the seat." Cameron felt the eyes of every passenger in first class upon him, understanding that this moment would define not just his immediate circumstances but potentially his faith in justice and fairness, the values his father had taught him about dignity and strength, being tested in ways that felt both personal and universal. "I'm not moving," Cameron said quietly, his voice carrying the calm determination of someone who had been taught to stand up for what was right even when the consequences were uncertain. "I purchased this seat legitimately, and I have every right to be here." Derek's face flushed with the kind of anger that came from having his authority challenged, especially by someone he had already decided didn't deserve the respect that came with first-class accommodations. His hand moving toward his radio to call for security, backup that would soon escalate this conflict beyond anything he could control. The other passengers watched in fascination and growing discomfort, some beginning to pull out their phones to record what was becoming an obviously unjust situation, while others shifted nervously in their seats, uncertain whether to intervene or remain silent witnesses to discrimination unfolding in real time before their eyes. "Captain, this is Derek in first class." The flight attendant spoke into his headset, his voice carrying throughout the cabin as he made his situation report. "I have a passenger refusing crew instructions and occupying a seat without proper authorization, requesting immediate assistance for removal." Cameron closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of his father's expectations and teachings, knowing that his response to this injustice would ripple outward in ways he couldn't yet predict, but understanding that backing down would mean accepting a world where dignity was conditional and justice was reserved for people who looked like they deserved it. The announcement over the cabin intercom carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, though. Captain Sarah Mitchell's voice held a note of weariness that came from dealing with passenger disputes that seemed to multiply with each passing year, creating delays and complications that made her job increasingly difficult. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a slight delay in our departure while we resolve a passenger issue. The captain announced, her professional tone masking the frustration that came with having to manage problems that should have been resolved at the gate, though she trusted her experienced crew to handle whatever situation required her intervention. Airport security officers, Robert Hayes and Lisa Chen, approached the aircraft with the efficient urgency of professionals who dealt with dozens of similar calls each day, though their assumptions about what they would find were already shaped by Derek's radio description of an unruly passenger refusing to follow crew instructions and disrupting the boarding process. Officer Hayes, a 15-year veteran of airport security, had developed what he considered a reliable instinct for quickly assessing passenger disputes, though his methods relied heavily on visual cues and unconscious biases that made him more likely to side with well-dressed, articulate complainants over younger passengers who didn't fit his profile of legitimate first-class travelers. "What seems to be the problem here?" Officer Hayes asked as he entered the first-class cabin, his question directed toward Derek rather than Cameron, his body language already suggesting that he had identified who represented authority and who represented the disruption that needed to be managed and removed. Derek launched into his explanation with the confident air of someone who believed his version of events was obviously correct, describing Cameron as an unauthorized passenger who had somehow obtained false documentation and was now refusing to cooperate with crew instructions to vacate the premium cabin. He claims to have a legitimate boarding pass, but it's clearly a screenshot or some kind of fake document, Derek explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone who dealt with these situations regularly. When I asked him to move to his proper seat in economy, he became belligerent and refused to follow crew instructions. Cameron sat quietly during Derek's presentation, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the flight attendant's agitated description of events, though he could see in Officer Hayes' expression that the security officer had already decided who to believe based on nothing more than appearances and assumptions. "Son, we're going to need you to come with us," Officer Hayes said, his tone leaving no room for discussion, his hand moving toward his handcuffs with the casual efficiency of someone who had removed countless passengers from aircraft without ever questioning whether those removals were justified. "Officer, if you would just scan my boarding pass, you can verify that I belong in this seat," Cameron said, his voice remaining respectful despite the escalating injustice of the situation. "I'm not trying to cause problems, I just want to sit in the seat I paid for." But Officer Hayes had already moved beyond verification to enforcement, his years of experience having taught him that passenger disputes were best resolved quickly rather than thoroughly, and that supporting crew authority was more important than investigating individual claims of innocence or fairness. "We can sort all that out at the security office," Hayes replied, reaching for Cameron's arm with the kind of casual force that suggested this was a routine procedure rather than a potential violation of civil rights. "Right now, you need to come with us so this flight can get underway." James Crawford felt his finger hovering over the record button on his phone, understanding that he was witnessing something that went beyond a simple passenger dispute. Something that revealed uncomfortable truths about how prejudice operated in supposedly civilized spaces, his business instincts telling him that this story would have ramifications far beyond the confines of this aircraft. The other first-class passengers watched in a mixture of fascination and discomfort, some beginning to whisper among themselves about whether the young man was actually causing any real disruption, while others remained silent, unwilling to challenge authority, even when that authority appeared to be acting unfairly. Cameron felt the officer's hand on his arm and made the conscious decision not to resist physically understanding that any struggle would only be used to justify whatever consequences followed. Though his cooperation felt like a betrayal of every principle his father had taught him about standing up for justice and dignity. "I'm not resisting," Cameron said clearly, his voice carrying throughout the cabin as he stood slowly gathering his backpack while maintaining his composure, despite the humiliation of being removed from a seat he had legitimately purchased. "But I want everyone to understand that this is wrong and that I have done nothing to deserve this treatment." Helena Richardson watched Cameron's removal with undisguised satisfaction, feeling vindicated in her assessment of the situation and pleased that proper standards were finally being enforced, though she would soon discover that her victory was actually the first step toward consequences she couldn't possibly imagine. The airport security office existed in the liminal space between the public areas of the terminal and the restricted zones where serious law enforcement took place. A sterile environment designed to process minor infractions and resolve disputes without the drama that might disturb paying passengers. Though Cameron's presence there was about to transform a routine procedure into a career-ending mistake for everyone involved, Officer Hayes completed his paperwork with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had processed hundreds of similar incidents, his assumption that this was just another case of an unauthorized passenger trying to upgrade illegally, making him careless about the details that might have revealed the magnitude of his error. "All right, son, let's start with some basic information," Hayes said, settling into his chair with the weary patience of someone who wanted to resolve this situation quickly so he could move on to more important matters. "What's your real name, and how did you get access to that fake boarding pass?" Cameron sat perfectly still in the plastic chair across from Hayes's desk, his hands folded in his lap, his expression calm despite the surreal injustice of being treated like a criminal for the crime of flying while black in first class. His father's teachings about maintaining dignity in the face of prejudice being tested in ways he had never imagined. "My name is Cameron Mitchell," he replied quietly, his voice carrying the kind of educated inflection that should have given Hayes pause about his assumptions, though the officer was too committed to his initial assessment to recognize the inconsistencies in his theory about unauthorized passengers and fake documentation. Hayes entered the name into his computer system with the bored efficiency of someone filling out routine paperwork, expecting to find either a clean record that would make Cameron's release easier to justify, or a criminal history that would validate his decision to treat this situation as a law enforcement matter. The computer screen filled with information that made Hayes pause his routine processing, suddenly interrupted by details that didn't match his expectations about who Cameron was supposed to be. Though his initial reaction was confusion rather than the panic that would soon follow as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. "Says here you're 19 years old. Enrolled at MIT. No criminal record," Hayes muttered, reading from the screen while trying to reconcile this information with his assumptions about fake boarding passes and unauthorized passengers. "What's your father's name? Victor Mitchell?" Cameron answered, simply watching Hayes' expression change as the name registered in the officer's memory, though he could see that the security guard was still struggling to connect the dots between the information on his screen and the reality of who was sitting across from his desk. Hayes's fingers moved across the keyboard with growing urgency as he searched for more information about Victor Mitchell, the results flooding his screen with articles from Forbes Business Week and Aviation Weekly photographs of a man who looked remarkably similar to the young passenger he had just arrested for attempting to fraudulently occupy a first-class seat. The blood drained from Hayes's face as he began to understand that Victor Mitchell wasn't just any businessman but the owner of Mitchell Global Aviation, the company that held the management contract for O'Hare International Airport, making Cameron not just a legitimate passenger, but the son of the man who essentially owned the building where Hayes was currently employed. "Oh God," Hayes whispered, his voice barely audible as he scrolled through news articles about Mitchell Global's latest acquisitions and expansion plans, realizing that he had just arrested the heir to an aviation empire for the crime of sitting in a seat that his family's company could probably buy outright without checking their account balance. Cameron watched the realization dawn on Hayes's face with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness, understanding that this moment of recognition would change everything for the officer. Though it wouldn't undo the humiliation and injustice that had already occurred, the damage to his faith in fairness and equality that would take much longer to heal. "I need to make a phone call," Cameron said quietly, reaching for his cell phone with the calm determination of someone who understood that the next few minutes would determine whether this incident became a private embarrassment or a public reckoning that would expose the prejudice and bias that infected even supposedly professional institutions. Hayes nodded numbly, his mind racing through the implications of what he had done, the potential consequences for his career and reputation, the lawsuits and investigations that would follow, though he was still too shocked to fully comprehend how completely his assumptions had led him astray. Cameron scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for, a simple entry that read, "Dad." Though the man on the other end of that call possessed the kind of power and influence that could reshape the aviation industry with a single decision, and whose reaction to his son's treatment was about to become the stuff of legend in security and law enforcement circles around the world. Victor Mitchell was reviewing quarterly earnings reports in his downtown Chicago office when his phone rang, the caller ID showing his son's number at a time when Cameron should have been somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, creating an immediate spike of concern that deepened into cold fury as he listened to Cameron's calm description of being arrested and detained for the crime of occupying a first-class seat while black. "Stay exactly where you are, son," Victor said, his voice carrying the deadly calm that his business associates had learned to fear more than any shouting or threats, the kind of controlled anger that preceded the complete destruction of careers and the restructuring of entire industries. "Don't say anything else to anyone until I get there." Victor's next call went to his head of security, Elena Rodriguez, a former Secret Service agent whose expertise in crisis management had helped Mitchell Global navigate hostile takeovers, regulatory challenges, and the kind of high-stakes negotiations where millions of dollars could be won or lost based on a single miscalculation. "Elena, I need a full response team at O'Hare Security in 15 minutes. Victor said, his voice carrying the urgency that transformed routine business operations into military precision campaigns. "My son has been illegally detained by airport security, and I want every detail of this incident documented and every person involved identified." Elena had worked for Victor long enough to understand that when he spoke in that particular tone, questioning his orders was not an option. Though she couldn't help wondering what had happened to provoke this level of response from a man who usually preferred subtle influence to dramatic displays of power. Within minutes, Mitchell Global's crisis response protocol was in full operation, with security teams dispatched from the corporate headquarters, legal experts reviewing detention procedures, and civil rights law and public relations specialists preparing for what could become a very public reckoning with issues of racial profiling and corporate accountability. The convoy that left downtown Chicago resembled a presidential motorcade more than a corporate emergency response, with armored vehicles carrying security personnel, legal representatives, and the kind of communications equipment that would allow Victor to coordinate a comprehensive campaign of consequences for everyone who had participated in his son's humiliation. Back at O'Hare, Officer Hayes watched his computer screen with growing panic as search results about Victor Mitchell revealed the true scope of his mistake. Articles describing a man who had transformed his inherited aircraft maintenance business into a global aviation empire that employed thousands of people and influenced policy at the highest levels of government. "I think we may have made a serious error," Hayes said to his supervisor, Sergeant Williams. his voice carrying the kind of desperate hope that comes from knowing you've stepped into something far beyond your ability to control or contain. "The kid we arrested his father is Victor Mitchell." Sergeant Williams felt his stomach drop as he recognized the name, understanding immediately that this wasn't just a case of mistaken identity, but a catastrophic failure of judgment that would have consequences rippling through every level of law enforcement and airport administration, potentially ending careers and triggering investigations that would expose patterns of bias and discrimination. "Tell me you verified his credentials before you arrested him?" Williams said, though Hayes's expression had already provided the answer that would soon become the centerpiece of lawsuits. Federal investigations and policy reviews that would reshape how airport security handled passenger disputes. The first sign that the situation had escalated beyond normal procedures came when the airport's main operations center received a call from the Federal Aviation Administration requesting immediate reports on any incidents involving passengers named Mitchell, a query that sent shockwaves through the administrative hierarchy as officials began to understand that they were dealing with someone whose influence extended far beyond normal corporate reach. Victor's convoy arrived at O'Hare with the kind of coordinated precision that made witnesses step back and stare black vehicles with tinted windows, disgorging security professionals, legal experts, and executives whose presence immediately transformed the airport's atmosphere from routine operations to crisis management mode. Airport Director Janet Morrison found herself running through terminals she usually toured at a leisurely pace, her mind racing through the potential consequences of having one of the aviation industry's most powerful figures respond personally to what should have been a minor passenger dispute, though she was beginning to understand that nothing about this situation would prove to be minor. Victor Mitchell stepped out of his vehicle with the calm purposefulness of someone whose presence could silence boardrooms and reshape industries. His charcoal gray suit and expensive briefcase providing no indication of the storm of consequences he was about to unleash on everyone who had participated in his son's illegal detention. Elena Rodriguez coordinated the security team's deployment with military efficiency, ensuring that every entrance to the detention facility was monitored. Every conversation was being recorded, and every person involved in Cameron's arrest would be identified and held accountable for their decisions and actions. The transformation of O'Hare's security offices from a quiet administrative area to the epicenter of a corporate and legal earthquake took less than 20 minutes. Though the reverberations would be felt for years to come as Victor Mitchell prepared to demonstrate exactly why attacking his family was the kind of mistake that ended careers and reshaped entire industries. Victor Mitchell's entrance into the airport security office carried the gravitational force of a man who had spent 3 decades accumulating the kind of power that could reshape industries with a phone call, his presence immediately transforming the sterile government space into something that felt more like a courtroom where judgment was about to be rendered. Officer Hayes stood up so quickly that his chair rolled backward into the wall, his face pale with the understanding that his routine day had become the worst mistake of his professional life, though he still hadn't fully grasped the scope of consequences that were about to unfold around him like a hurricane. "Mr. Mitchell," Sergeant Williams stammered, appearing in the doorway with the desperate hope that his rank might provide some protection from the storm that was clearly building, though Victor's expression suggested that hierarchy would provide no shelter from what was coming next. Victor said nothing as he walked directly to where Cameron sat, his eyes taking in every detail of his son's condition, the slight redness around his wrists where handcuffs had been applied, the torn seam on his hoodie where he had been grabbed and dragged from the aircraft, each observation adding fuel to the controlled fire that was about to consume everyone responsible. "Are you hurt?" Victor asked, his voice soft enough that only Cameron could hear. Though everyone in the room felt the weight of that quiet question and the implications of how the answer might determine their fates. "I'm fine, Dad," Cameron replied, though his voice carried the exhaustion that came from being treated like a criminal for simply existing in a space where others didn't think he belonged, the kind of emotional damage that would take much longer to heal than any physical injuries. Victor placed a hand on his son's shoulder. a gesture that appeared gentle but carried all the protective fury of a father who had spent 19 years trying to shield his child from exactly this kind of systematic humiliation, knowing that his wealth and influence had failed to protect Cameron from the ugly reality of prejudice disguised as procedure. Sergeant Williams Victor said, turning toward the supervisor with the kind of calm that preceded complete institutional destruction, "I want a detailed explanation of why my son was removed from a flight he had legitimate permission to board, arrested without cause, and detained for exercising his legal right to occupy a seat he purchased." Williams found himself in the impossible position of trying to explain the inexplicable, knowing that every word he spoke was being recorded by Victor's legal team and would soon become evidence in lawsuits that would reshape how airport security handled passenger interactions, particularly those involving people of color. "Sir, there appears to have been a misunderstanding." Williams began, his voice carrying the desperate hope that minimizing language might somehow reduce the magnitude of the crisis that was unfolding around him. Officer Hayes responded to a crew request for assistance with an unruly passenger who was allegedly occupying a seat without proper authorization. Allegedly, Victor repeated the single word, carrying enough force to make everyone in the room understand that their careers were hanging by threads that were rapidly fraying. "My son was allegedly occupying a seat that he purchased weeks ago with a credit card that bears his name on an airline that operates under leases signed by my company." Elena Rodriguez stepped forward with a tablet containing the preliminary investigation results. Her expression professional but carrying undertones of satisfaction as she presented evidence that would transform this incident from an unfortunate misunderstanding into a federal case study in civil rights violations and institutional racism. "Mr. Mitchell, we've confirmed that Cameron's boarding pass was legitimate, that his frequent flyer status entitled him to priority boarding, and that at no point did any airline personnel attempt to verify his credentials through proper channels." Elena reported, her voice carrying the clinical precision of someone presenting evidence that would destroy careers and end lawsuits. Victor nodded, his expression remaining calm despite the white-hot fury building inside him as he contemplated the systematic failures that had led to his son being treated like a criminal by people whose paychecks ultimately depended on the contracts his company provided to the airport and its security operations. Officer Hayes Victor said, turning toward the security officer with the kind of focused attention that made grown men confess to crimes they hadn't committed, "I want you to explain to me how a 19-year-old college student sitting quietly in a seat he purchased became such a threat to aviation security that you felt justified in handcuffing him and dragging him off an aircraft." Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but found that no words emerged, his mind completely blank as he faced the impossible task of explaining prejudice and bias to the father of the young man he had humiliated, knowing that whatever he said would only make his situation worse. The flight attendant said the passenger was unruly and refused crew instructions. Hayes finally managed, though his voice carried no conviction, his own words sounding hollow even to him as he spoke them. "Show me the video footage," Victor commanded, his tone leaving no room for discussion or delay. "I want to see every moment of this alleged unruly behavior, every instance of my son refusing reasonable crew instructions, every piece of evidence that justified handcuffing a teenager for sitting in a seat he legitimately purchased." The silence that followed stretched long enough for everyone in the room to understand that no such evidence existed, that Cameron's only crime had been existing in a space where others had decided he didn't belong, though none of them had possessed the courage or integrity to verify their assumptions before acting on them. Victor's phone buzzed with a text message that made him smile for the first time since arriving at the airport, though his expression of satisfaction only deepened the terror of everyone watching him, understanding that whatever communication he had just received was about to make their situations infinitely worse. "Gentlemen," Victor said, his voice carrying the finality of someone announcing judgments that had already been rendered and would soon be executed, "I've just received confirmation that Mitchell Global Aviation has decided to terminate our security services contract with O'Hare International, effective immediately pending a comprehensive review of training procedures and bias elimination protocols. The news that Mitchell Global Aviation had just canceled their security contract hit O'Hare International Airport like a financial tsunami. The reverberations spreading through every level of administration as officials began calculating the immediate and long-term consequences of losing their most important corporate partnership over what should have been a routine passenger interaction. Airport Director Janet Morrison burst into the security office with the kind of desperate energy that comes from watching your career collapse in real time. Her phone buzzing with calls from city officials, airline executives, and federal regulators who were all demanding explanations for how a simple passenger dispute had escalated into a corporate crisis with national implications. "Mr. Mitchell, please." Morrison pleaded her professional composure, cracking under the weight of understanding that her airport was about to lose not just a security contract, but potentially dozens of other business relationships that depended on Mitchell Global's continued partnership and goodwill. "Surely we can resolve this through proper channels without involving contract terminations." Victor regarded Morrison with the cold assessment of someone evaluating whether a business relationship could be salvaged, or whether complete severance was the only acceptable outcome, his decision process visible in the calculating silence that stretched uncomfortably long for everyone present. Director Morrison Victor replied, his voice carrying the kind of corporate politeness that preceded complete destruction. "My company has spent 15 years building O'Hare into one of the premier aviation hubs in North America, investing billions of dollars in infrastructure technology and partnerships that have created thousands of jobs and generated enormous revenue for this city." Morrison nodded, desperately understanding that Victor was building toward a conclusion that would reshape her airport's future, in ways she was powerless to control or mitigate, though she continued to hope that some form of negotiation might still be possible. In return for that investment, Victor continued, "I expected basic professional standards that would ensure all passengers, regardless of their appearance or background, would be treated with dignity and respect. Today, your security team violated that trust in the most fundamental way possible." Cameron watched his father exercise the kind of controlled power that had built their family's empire, understanding that this moment represented more than just personal vindication, but a larger statement about accountability and consequences that would ripple through the aviation industry for years to come. Officer Hayes found himself in the surreal position of watching his employer's most important contract being terminated as a direct result of his decisions. The financial implications of his prejudice becoming visible in real time as phone calls and emergency meetings transformed abstract concepts of bias into concrete economic consequences. However, Victor said, his tone shifting slightly in a way that made everyone lean forward with desperate attention, "I am not interested in punishing innocent employees for the failures of their leadership. Nor am I interested in disrupting air travel for millions of passengers who had nothing to do with this incident." Elena Rodriguez stepped forward with a comprehensive proposal that she had been developing since the convoy left downtown Chicago, a detailed plan for transforming this crisis into an opportunity for industry-wide reform that would serve as a model for addressing bias and discrimination in transportation settings. "Mitchell Global is prepared to reinstate our security contract and extend our partnerships with O'Hare," Elena announced, contingent upon the implementation of comprehensive bias training for all personnel, the establishment of independent oversight procedures for passenger complaints, and the creation of accountability measures that ensure incidents like this never happen again. Morrison felt a surge of relief mixed with apprehension, understanding that these terms represented both salvation for her airport and acknowledgement that fundamental changes would be required to prevent future crises, though the alternative of losing Mitchell Global's partnership entirely was unthinkable. Additionally, Victor continued, "Officer Hayes will be immediately suspended pending completion of extensive bias training and psychological evaluation. Sergeant Williams will undergo supervisory retraining with focus on proper verification procedures, and all security personnel will complete cultural sensitivity courses within 60 days. Hayes understood that his career in airport security was effectively over, though the alternative of criminal charges and federal civil rights violations made suspension and retraining seem almost generous, despite the public humiliation that would accompany his association with what was already becoming a national news story. As for the flight crew, Victor set his attention turning toward the aircraft, where Derek Walsh was still attempting to manage the delayed departure while dealing with increasingly agitated passengers who were demanding explanations for the extended ground time that will require a separate conversation with airline management. Cameron felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness as he watched the consequences unfold, understanding that justice was being served, but also recognizing that the damage to his faith in institutional fairness would take much longer to repair than the policy changes his father was implementing. Dad Cameron said quietly, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned difficult lessons about power prejudice and the responsibility that comes with the ability to reshape other people's lives. I think they understand now that their actions have consequences. Victor looked at his son with pride that went beyond Cameron's academic achievements or business potential, recognizing the moral courage that had allowed him to endure humiliation with dignity and to advocate for justice rather than revenge, qualities that would serve him well as he eventually inherited the responsibility of using power to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The journey back to Flight 847 carried the weight of transformation, with Victor and Cameron walking through terminals that would never again be the same, their passage observed by airport personnel, who now understood that the young man in the hoodie possessed the kind of family connections that could reshape their professional lives with a single phone call. Flight attendant Derek Walsh stood in the aircraft doorway with the sick understanding that his 15-year career in aviation was about to end in the most public and humiliating way possible, his prejudiced assumptions having transformed what should have been a routine international flight into a national case study of institutional bias and discrimination. Mr. Mitchell Derek said as Victor and Cameron approached the aircraft, his voice carrying the desperate hope that some form of apology might mitigate the consequences that were clearly heading his way like an avalanche. Though he was beginning to understand that his actions had created damage that extended far beyond simple employment termination. Victor paused in the doorway, his expression carrying the kind of controlled assessment that made Derek understand he was being evaluated not just as an employee who had made a mistake, but as a representative of all the systematic barriers that had tried to prevent his son from accessing the opportunities and respect that should have been his birthright. Mr. Walsh Victor replied, his tone carrying the finality of someone delivering a verdict that had already been decided through proper deliberation. Your employment with this airline has been terminated, effective immediately, and your eligibility for employment in the aviation industry will depend upon your successful completion of comprehensive bias training and community service requirements. Derek's face went white as he realized that his prejudice hadn't just cost him his current job, but potentially his entire career path, the financial and professional consequences of his assumptions becoming visible as security personnel appeared to escort him from the aircraft that he would never again be qualified to serve. The first-class cabin had been transformed during the extended delay, with passengers who had initially supported Helena Richardson's complaints now understanding that they had witnessed and participated in a profound injustice, their whispered conversations carrying the uncomfortable recognition of their own complicity in perpetuating bias. Helena Richardson herself sat in stunned silence, her mind struggling to process the reality that the young man she had dismissed as suspicious and inappropriate was actually the son of the most powerful figure in the aviation industry, her carefully constructed world view collapsing as she confronted the implications of her prejudice. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the announcement from the cockpit, the captain's voice carrying a professional calm that masked the chaos that had engulfed the airline's operations. as executives scrambled to contain the damage from what was already being called the O'Hare discrimination incident. We apologize for the extended delay and will be departing momentarily for London Heathrow. Cameron settled back into seat 2A, the same window seat that had been the epicenter of so much conflict, though now it felt less like a battleground and more like a symbol of hard-won justice, his father's presence in the adjacent seat providing comfort that went beyond family support to represent validation of principles worth fighting for. James Crawford had spent the delay uploading his video footage to secure servers, understanding that he had documented something that would become historically significant, a real-time example of how prejudice operated in supposedly civilized spaces and how courage and power could combine to demand accountability. "How do you feel?" son Victor asked as the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, beginning the journey that should have started hours earlier, if not for the systematic failures that had nearly derailed Cameron's faith in justice and equality. "Tired," Cameron replied honestly, though his voice also carried a note of satisfaction that came from knowing his ordeal had created opportunities for change that would benefit countless future travelers who might otherwise face similar discrimination, but also proud that we stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Victor smiled, understanding that his son had passed a test that had nothing to do with academic achievement or business acumen, and everything to do with character integrity and the moral courage required to transform personal adversity into opportunities for broader social progress. As Flight 847 finally lifted off from Chicago, carrying them toward London and the technology summit that had originally motivated this journey, both father and son understood that they were also carrying forward a story that would inspire others to demand dignity, respect, and equal treatment in all the spaces where human beings encountered each other as fellow travelers on life's complicated journey. James Crawford's video began its viral journey while Flight 847 was still climbing toward cruising altitude. The businessman's 2.5 million followers sharing footage that captured not just Helena Richardson's prejudiced assumptions, but also the systematic failures of airline and security personnel who had chosen bias over verification, creating a digital firestorm that would reshape conversations about discrimination in commercial aviation. The hashtag first class, while Black began trending within hours, joined by hashtag Airport Karen and hashtag Mitchell Justice as social media users shared their own experiences of travel discrimination and celebrated Cameron's dignified response to prejudice, his calm demeanor under pressure, becoming a powerful symbol of how to maintain integrity when confronted with systematic injustice. Helena Richardson discovered the scope of her public humiliation when her phone began receiving hundreds of notifications messages from former friends expressing shock and disappointment. Business associates distancing themselves from her toxic reputation and strangers sharing their opinions about her behavior in terms that made clear her social status had been permanently destroyed. The financial consequences followed quickly, with her late husband's pharmaceutical company's board of directors issuing a statement distancing the organization from Helena's actions. Charitable organizations, removing her name from donor lists and country clubs, quietly suggesting that her membership might be more comfortable at other establishments. Derek Walsh found himself unemployable in the aviation industry within 48 hours of the video's release, his LinkedIn profile becoming a cautionary tale about the career consequences of acting on unconscious bias, though he would eventually use his experience as the foundation for a new career training airline personnel about the importance of fair treatment for all passengers. Major news networks picked up the story, with aviation experts, civil rights leaders, and bias researchers using Cameron's experience to illustrate broader patterns of discrimination that affected millions of travelers, particularly people of color, who faced additional scrutiny and suspicion simply for accessing premium services they had legitimately purchased. Victor Mitchell used the media attention strategically, leveraging his influence to advocate for industry-wide policy changes that would create accountability mechanisms for addressing travel discrimination, transforming his son's negative experience into a catalyst for positive institutional reform that would benefit countless future passengers. Airport Director Janet Morrison found herself testifying before congressional subcommittees about bias in transportation security, her airport becoming a case study in how institutional prejudice could escalate into national crises when combined with poor training, inadequate oversight, and leadership failures that prioritized assumptions over verification. The ripple effects extended beyond individual consequences to corporate accountability, with airlines implementing new training programs, security companies revising their procedures, and airport authorities establishing independent oversight boards to investigate complaints about discriminatory treatment of passengers. Cameron's initial reluctance to speak publicly about his experience gradually evolved into recognition that his story could serve as a powerful tool for education and advocacy. His articulate descriptions of how prejudice felt from the inside, helping audiences understand the human impact of bias in ways that statistics and studies couldn't convey. 6 months after the incident, Helena Richardson sat in the lobby of a legal aid clinic, waiting to meet with attorneys who specialized in helping people navigate the financial consequences of public scandals. Her designer handbags replaced with practical totes, her carefully maintained appearance now reflecting the reality of significantly reduced circumstances. The complete destruction of her social standing had forced Helena to confront uncomfortable truths about the foundations of her identity. Recognizing that her sense of superiority had been built on inherited privilege rather than personal achievement, and that her aggressive defense of social hierarchies had been motivated more by insecurity than by genuine conviction about merit or worthiness. Her attempts to rebuild her reputation had led her to volunteer with civil rights organizations' work that initially felt like penance, but gradually became genuine education, as she learned about the systematic barriers that prevented others from accessing the opportunities she had always taken for granted, her perspective slowly shifting from defensiveness to understanding. Derek Walsh had spent the same 6 months in court-mandated bias training his sessions with psychologists and diversity experts, forcing him to examine the assumptions that had shaped his interactions with passengers, particularly his tendency to view certain types of people as inherently more likely to cause problems or behave inappropriately. His new career as a bias trainer for airline personnel had emerged from his willingness to publicly acknowledge his mistakes and share his story as a cautionary tale, his presentations combining personal accountability with practical strategies for recognizing and interrupting prejudiced thinking before it translated into discriminatory actions. Officer Hayes had undergone similar transformation, his suspension and retraining leading to a new position, developing bias awareness programs for law enforcement agencies. His experience serving as a powerful example of how unconscious prejudice could transform routine procedures into civil rights violations, with devastating consequences for everyone involved. The institutional changes implemented at O'Hare had become a model for airports nationwide, with bias training programs, independent oversight procedures, and accountability measures that created real consequences for discriminatory behavior, transforming Cameron's negative experience into positive change that protected countless future travelers. Cameron himself had emerged from the experience with a deeper understanding of both the persistence of prejudice and the power of strategic response. His speaking engagements at universities and corporate events, focusing on the importance of maintaining dignity when confronted with injustice, while also demanding accountability from institutions that failed to protect equal treatment. Victor's pride in his son had grown beyond traditional parental satisfaction to encompass recognition that Cameron possessed the moral courage and strategic thinking necessary to use their family's influence responsibly, advocating for justice in ways that created lasting change rather than simply punishing individual wrongdoers. The aviation industry's response to the incident had included comprehensive policy reviews, bias training requirements, and oversight mechanisms that made discrimination more difficult to perpetrate and easier to address when it occurred, transforming one family's negative experience into industry-wide progress toward equal treatment for all passengers. Research studies examining the incident had provided valuable insights into how unconscious bias operated in customer service environments, with Cameron's experience serving as a case study for understanding the intersection of race, class, and perceived authority in spaces where different social groups encountered each other in potentially tense situations. 1 year after the incident that had transformed his understanding of justice and power, Cameron Mitchell stood before an audience of airline executives, government regulators, and civil rights advocates at the International Aviation Equality Summit in London, the same destination he had been trying to reach when prejudice had derailed his journey and ultimately created opportunities for even more significant travel. His presentation focused on the systematic nature of transportation discrimination, using his own experience as a starting point for broader discussions about how bias operated in commercial aviation, the ways that assumptions about who belonged in premium spaces created barriers for travelers of color, and the importance of accountability mechanisms that created real consequences for discriminatory behavior. "The question isn't whether bias exists in our industry," Cameron said, his voice carrying the authority that came from personal experience combined with academic research, "but whether we're committed to creating systems that recognize and interrupt prejudice before it translates into harmful actions that damage both individual travelers and institutional credibility." In the audience, Helena Richardson sat quietly in the back row, her presence a surprise that Cameron had discovered only moments before taking the stage, though her attendance represented genuine commitment to understanding rather than mere curiosity about the young man whose life she had tried to disrupt through her prejudiced assumptions. After his presentation, Helena approached Cameron with the hesitant demeanor of someone seeking forgiveness, while understanding that redemption required more than apology. Her voice carrying genuine remorse as she acknowledged the harm her actions had caused and her commitment to using her remaining influence to advocate for the changes he had described. "I want you to know that I've spent this year learning about the impact of prejudice, not just on the people who experience it directly, but on the communities and institutions that allow it to persist," Helena said, her voice carrying none of the imperious tone that had characterized their first encounter. "I hope my work with civil rights organizations can contribute to the changes you're advocating." Cameron accepted her apology with the grace that had characterized his response to the original injustice, understanding that transformation required acknowledging people's capacity for growth while also maintaining accountability for past actions. His response focused more on future collaboration than on relitigating past grievances. Derek Walsh had traveled to London specifically to attend Cameron's presentation, his new career as a bias trainer, having taught him that genuine accountability required ongoing education and commitment rather than simple recognition of past mistakes. His presence in the audience representing his dedication to becoming part of the solution rather than remaining defensive about his role in creating problems. James Crawford, whose video had initiated the viral response that transformed Cameron's private ordeal into public advocacy, had used his platform to continue documenting instances of travel discrimination. His business success providing resources for supporting travelers who faced similar challenges but lacked the family connections that had enabled Cameron's eventual vindication. Victor watched his son's presentation with pride that encompassed not just Cameron's professional accomplishments, but his moral development, recognizing that the young man on stage possessed the wisdom and integrity necessary to carry forward their family's legacy of using power responsibly to protect and advance opportunities for others. Airport officials from around the world attended the summit to learn about bias prevention strategies, with O'Hare's transformation serving as a case study for how crisis could be converted into opportunity for institutional improvement. Cameron's experience providing a roadmap for addressing discrimination before it escalated into public relations disasters and legal challenges. The technology Cameron had originally planned to present in London had been successfully implemented across European aviation systems, his innovations in sustainable aircraft design contributing to environmental progress, while his advocacy work addressed social justice issues, demonstrating that technical expertise and moral leadership could be combined to create multiple forms of positive change. As the summit concluded, Cameron found himself surrounded by young travelers of color who shared their own stories of discrimination and expressed gratitude for his advocacy. Their experiences confirming that his ordeal had been part of a larger pattern, while also demonstrating that his response had inspired others to demand better treatment and accountability from transportation providers. The final panel discussion focused on measuring progress in reducing travel discrimination with data, showing significant improvements in complaint resolution bias, training effectiveness, and passenger satisfaction among travelers who had previously reported discriminatory treatment. Evidence that individual courage combined with institutional commitment could create measurable social progress. Cameron's closing remarks emphasized that equality in transportation represented broader principles about human dignity and equal access to opportunities, his experience serving as a reminder that justice required vigilant advocacy and institutional accountability, but also demonstrating that positive change was possible when people of goodwill committed to creating systems that served everyone fairly. As he left the stage to sustained applause, Cameron understood that his journey from victim to advocate had been completed, though his commitment to fighting discrimination and promoting equality would continue throughout his career. His family's influence, now permanently dedicated to ensuring that no future traveler would endure the humiliation he had experienced for the crime of existing in spaces where others didn't think he belonged. Cameron Mitchell's experience sparked industry-wide changes that made air travel more equitable for millions. His choice to seek justice rather than revenge created lasting improvements in training programs, oversight procedures, and accountability measures that continue protecting travelers from discrimination. The viral video became a turning point that transformed how airlines, airports, and security agencies approach bias prevention and complaint resolution. Helena Richardson's fall served as a cautionary tale about privilege and prejudice, while her subsequent advocacy work proved that even the most entrenched biases can be overcome through genuine self-reflection and commitment to change. Her transformation from perpetrator to ally demonstrated that people can learn from their mistakes and contribute to positive social progress, though the process required acknowledging harm and accepting responsibility for past actions. The incident reminded the world that dignity isn't determined by appearance, and that true power lies not in crushing others but in lifting them up through justice, compassion, and the courage to do what's right. Cameron's story continues inspiring travelers who face discrimination to document their experiences, demand accountability, and advocate for the equal treatment that should be every person's birthright. If this story moved you, please give our video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more true stories of justice and transformation. Share your thoughts in the comments about how we can continue working together to create a more equitable world for all travelers. Thanks for watching. And remember that every act of courage, no matter how small, can spark changes that benefit countless others.